These Appalachian nighttime horror stories are going to freeze your blood, so before we dive in, make sure you subscribe with notifications on so you never miss the next scary upload. And if you are brave enough, drop your location in the comments. Let's get into it. It always begins the same way in Appalachia, with the sound of crickets and the thick smell of pine carried through the night air. People often think of the mountains as peaceful, but once the sun drops below the ridges, the woods change, shadows grow longer, and noises take on shapes in the imagination. Tonight, I want to share 7 true stories from Appalachia that locals swear happened under the cover of night. Each one chilling enough to freeze your blood. These stories come from hikers, campers, and lifelong mountain residents who have lived to tell their encounters with the unknown. The first story takes us deep into the Blue Ridge, to a cabin that was supposed to be a retreat, a safe getaway from the chaos of city life. Instead, it became the site of something the survivor still struggles to explain. He had rented the cabin with his girlfriend one October weekend. The leaves were turning orange and red, and the small dirt road leading up to the cabin was littered with fallen branches. When they arrived, the place looked perfect from the outside. Rustic wood beams, a chimney and a porch swing swaying in the autumn breeze. But once inside, he noticed something off. The air felt too cold for a cabin with no open windows. There was also a faint smell, like old iron, lingering in the walls. The first night passed quietly enough, though his girlfriend woke him around 3 in the morning, swearing she had heard someone pacing outside on the gravel. He got up, flashlight in hand, and scanned the yard. Nothing. The woods were silent, eerily so, as though every creature had gone still. They brushed it off as nerves. But he could not shake the feeling of being watched. The second night was different. After they cooked dinner, they sat on the porch swing, drinking wine. The forest around them seemed alive with motion, but when he shined the flashlight into the trees, the beams hit nothing but branches. His girlfriend leaned close and whispered, "Do you hear that?" At first he thought it was the rustle of leaves, but then he recognized it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. He called out, thinking maybe it was another hiker or a hunter passing by. No answer. The steps stopped, and the night became heavy with silence. They hurried inside, locked the doors, and sat on the couch, waiting. At around 2 in the morning, a knock echoed through the cabin, not a frantic knock, but a slow, measured tap. He froze. His girlfriend grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin. The knock repeated 3 times. Steady and patient, he wanted to yell, to tell whoever it was to leave, but fear kept his throat dry. Finally, he crept to the window and pulled the curtain just enough to peek out. No one was there. The knocking stopped, but they did not sleep for the rest of the night. On the 3rd day, they decided to cut their trip short as they packed. He stepped outside to load the car and saw something on the porch swing. It was his flashlight, the one he had used on the first night, placed neatly in the center of the seat. The problem was he had left it inside on the kitchen counter. He asked his girlfriend if she had moved it. She shook her head, pale and trembling. They drove away without looking back, the flashlight still resting on the swing, as though someone wanted them to know they had been inside. Closer than they realized, that cabin still rents out, and locals whisper about strange things happening there. Guests complain of missing items, knocks in the night, and the feeling that they are not alone. No one has ever caught the person or thing responsible. The second story comes from a lifelong Appalachian resident, a man who grew up hunting in the woods with his father. He never believed in ghost stories, until one particular November evening changed his mind forever. He had set out before dusk, planning to check traps he had set along a narrow ridge. By the time he finished, darkness was closing in. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the woods felt unusually quiet. He began the walk back to his truck, the beam of his headlamp bouncing off the trees. That was when he heard it. Someone walking behind him. He stopped, listening. The steps stopped too. He turned, shining the light into the trees, but saw nothing, convinced it was his imagination. He kept going. A few minutes later, he heard it again. This time, the steps were closer. He spun around, light sweeping through the brush. Still nothing. He called out, "Hello? Who's out there?" His voice echoed through the hollow. Unanswered by now, his heart was racing. He decided to cut off the trail and take a shortcut he knew well, a steep path down toward a creek. As he descended, his boot slipped and he tumbled to the ground. His headlamp flickered but stayed on. When he pushed himself up, he saw it. Standing on the ridge above him was a tall figure, completely still, too far away to make out details, but close enough to know it was watching. He shouted again, demanding to know who it was. The figure did not move. He scrambled up, grabbed his pack, and half ran, half slid down the slope until he reached the creek. The cold water splashed against his boots as he crossed. When he reached the opposite bank, he looked back. The ridge was empty. The figure was gone. He never hunted that area again. To this day, he swears the figure was real, not a trick of the eyes. And he remembers one last detail that chills him the most. The ridge where the figure stood had no trail. No way up and no way down. Locals say the mountains are full of watchers, figures that appear in the night, especially near ridges and creeks. Some believe they are spirits of those who never left the mountains, doomed to wander after dark. As we move into the third story, remember this in Appalachia: the night belongs to the mountains, not to us. They say the mountains never sleep, that even when the people tucked away in their cabins drift off, the woods remain alive with movement. That was the thought running through Claire's mind as she walked the gravel path leading to her grandmother's house late one autumn night. She had been visiting a friend and misjudged how quickly the sun sets in Appalachia once it dips behind the ridges. By the time she left, the world was painted in dark blues and grays, the air cold enough that each breath left a faint cloud in the beam of her phone's flashlight. Her grandmother's house was less than a mile away, a straight shot down the path. But halfway through the walk, Claire felt uneasy. The woods pressed in on both sides, the branches skeletal against the sky. She told herself it was nothing, just the natural fear of walking alone at night. But then she heard something that made her freeze in place. It was the crunch of leaves, slow and deliberate. Matching her steps, she spun around. Shining her phone's light behind her, the path stretched out, empty. The sound stopped too, as if whoever or whatever was there had frozen the moment she turned. Her heart pounded as she forced herself to keep moving. The gravel shifted beneath her boots, each step feeling heavier than the last. After only a few seconds, she heard it again. Footsteps. Trailing her at the same pace, Claire quickened her stride. The sound followed, still keeping pace, as though the thing behind her wanted her to know she was not alone, but did not want to be seen. She tried to call her grandmother, but her phone flashed no service in the corner of the screen. The isolation hit her like a punch. It was just her, the woods, and the sound of someone stalking her from the dark. 100 yards from the house, she began to run. Her boots crunched and skidded on the gravel, breath tearing in and out of her lungs. The sound behind her grew faster too, not quite running but closing in. When her grandmother's porch light finally came into view, Claire sprinted up the steps, yanking the door open and slamming it shut behind her. She locked it, chest heaving, and turned to see her grandmother rising from a chair in the living room. "What's wrong, honey?" her grandmother asked, alarmed. Claire could not speak at first, pointing instead toward the front window together. They watched as the gravel path beyond the yard lay still and empty. No footsteps, no stalker, only silence. Her grandmother reached over and touched her hand, whispering, "You don't walk that path alone at night, not here. Not ever." Claire slept in the guest room that night, too shaken to return home, and though she never saw who, or what, had followed her, she swore she could still hear the faint crunch of leaves outside her window as she drifted into uneasy sleep. The mountains have a way of reminding you that you are not their only guest. Not far from that ridge, another man found himself caught in the grip of the unknown. His name was Tom, and he had been working the late shift at a small diner that sat near the edge of the forest. After closing, it was his job to take the trash out back and drop it into the large dumpster. The diner was old, the kind with buzzing neon signs and cracked vinyl seats, and the back alley where the dumpster sat was poorly lit. Most nights, Tom would toss the bags in quickly and hurry back inside, never lingering longer than he had to. But one night in early winter, he lingered just a moment too long. As he lifted the lid of the dumpster, a sound stopped him cold. It was a whisper, so faint he almost thought he imagined it. He stood there, bag in hand, listening. The whisper came again. Not words he could understand, but low and urgent, like someone speaking just beyond his range of hearing. He turned, scanning the alley, but it was empty. His breath rose in misty clouds, the cold biting at his fingers. He dropped the bag into the dumpster and started back toward the diner. That was when the whisper shifted. It grew louder, coming from behind him. Closer now, he spun again, but the alley remained empty, only the shadows stretching against the brick walls. Then he noticed something that made his stomach knot. His shadow on the ground was joined by another. Tall, impossibly tall, standing just a few feet away. Tom froze, afraid to look up. The shadow did not move, but he could feel it there, looming slowly, with every ounce of courage he had. He raised his eyes. Nothing. The alley was bare, yet the shadow stayed beside his own, stretching across the pavement. The whisper grew louder, wrapping around him, curling into his ears like smoke. He bolted, rushing through the back door and slamming it shut behind him. His co-workers stared as he stood there, pale and shaking, muttering about shadows that did not belong. He never closed the diner again after that night. In fact, he quit within a week, unwilling to set foot in that alley again. Locals who hear his story nod knowingly. Shadows, they say, are not always your own in the mountains. Sometimes they belong to something else entirely. The night has a way of distorting what we see, making the ordinary sinister. That is what happened to a group of friends who set out to camp near a ridge known for its sweeping views. They had brought tents, sleeping bags, and a cooler of food, eager to enjoy a night under the stars. By dusk, the fire was crackling, and the sound of laughter carried into the trees. But as the night deepened, the mood shifted. The fire burned low, and the forest grew unnaturally still. One of the friends, Jason, pointed out how quiet it was, how even the crickets had gone silent. The others dismissed it, too tired and buzzed to care. Hours later, Jason woke to the sound of voices outside his tent. He thought maybe his friends were up talking, but when he checked, the other tents were zipped shut. Their occupants asleep. The voices continued low and hushed, moving just beyond the glow of the dying fire. He strained to listen, but the words were unintelligible, like a foreign language whispered too fast to follow. Then came the crunch of leaves. Jason grabbed his flashlight and shined it toward the sound. The beam caught movement, shadows darting between the trees, faster than any person should be able to move. His heart pounded as he scrambled to wake the others. By the time they emerged, the voices had stopped, and the forest lay quiet once more. They packed up at dawn, too unnerved to stay another night later. When Jason told the story to a park ranger, the man only shook his head and said, "You should count yourself lucky. Not everyone who hears them comes back. The mountains hold secrets, and sometimes those secrets slip into the night to remind us how fragile our place here really is." The night had a chill that settled into the bones, the kind of cold that feels older than weather itself, as though the earth had been holding its breath for centuries. Miles from the nearest town, Daniel trudged along an unmarked logging road with nothing but the glow of his lantern to guide him. He had driven out to check an old family hunting cabin that had not been used in years. His uncle warned him about going after dark, but Daniel insisted it would be fine. It was not fine. The cabin sat tucked into a hollow, surrounded by towering pines that blocked out the stars. The lantern light wavered across the front porch, illuminating warped wood and a door that hung slightly crooked on its hinges. As Daniel stepped inside, the smell hit him: mold, wet earth, and something sharper underneath. Metallic like rust, he chalked it up to years of disuse. He set the lantern on the table, its glow casting long shadows across the walls. The place looked undisturbed, dust thick on the shelves, cobwebs hanging in the corners. But then he noticed the floor. A line of footprints in the dust stretched across the room, fresh and unmistakable. His blood turned cold. No one had been in the cabin for over a decade. Not since his grandfather's passing. He backed up toward the door, his eyes scanning the dim corners. That was when he heard it. A creak, slow and deliberate from the loft above. Daniel froze, heart hammering. The loft was nothing more than a crawl space for storage, accessible by a rickety ladder. He swallowed hard, trying to convince himself it was just the wood settling. But then came another sound, a dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor above him. He killed the lantern. Darkness swallowed him whole, but he could not bear to leave it lit. Could not let whoever or whatever was up there see him clearly. For long minutes he stood in the dark, straining to hear. The dragging stopped. Silence, and then so close it made his skin crawl. A voice whispered his name. He bolted. He tore the door open and sprinted into the night, lantern forgotten. Branches tore at his jacket as he stumbled down the logging road, not daring to look back. By the time he reached his truck, his lungs burned, and his hands shook too badly to fit the key into the ignition. When he finally made it home, he swore he would never set foot near that cabin again. Months later, curiosity got the better of him, and he drove out one afternoon. Sunlight filtered through the trees, chasing away the dread. But when he stepped inside, his stomach dropped. The footprints were still there, leading across the dusty floor, and this time, in the middle of the room, lay his lantern burnt out, though he had never gone back for it. The mountains do not always let you leave things behind. Farther north, a college student named Hannah took a night drive with friends, winding through back roads that cut across the mountains like veins. They were restless, looking for something to do, daring each other to visit an old cemetery said to be haunted. Laughter filled the car as they sped through the night. Music loud, windows down. The cemetery sat behind a rusted gate, surrounded by leaning stones so weathered most names were illegible. They parked on the roadside, their headlights cutting across the crooked markers. The air felt thick, heavy with the smell of damp leaves. They joked at first, daring each other to walk between the stones. Hannah, braver than the others, volunteered. She stepped past the gate, her sneakers crunching against the gravel path. The night seemed to hush around her. Even the laughter of her friends faded as she walked deeper among the graves. She paused at one stone, its surface cracked and worn, the name long gone. A sudden gust of wind swept through, carrying with it the faint sound of children's laughter. It was distant, eerie, like it came from the other side of the hill. Her friends called her back, their voices laced with nerves. She turned, ready to rejoin them, when she caught sight of movement at the far end of the cemetery. A figure, small and pale, darted between the stones. Her stomach dropped. It looked like a child, barefoot, its face blurred by shadow. She blinked and it was gone. Heart racing, she hurried back to the gate, her friends crowding around her, asking what she saw. She lied, saying it was nothing. But deep down, she knew it was not her imagination. That night, long after they dropped her off, Hannah lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Sleep came slow, uneasy. Sometime after midnight, she woke to the sound of soft footsteps in her room. She sat up, her breath caught in her throat. In the faint glow from the streetlight outside, she saw them, small, wet footprints leading across her floor, stopping right beside her bed. She screamed, but no one came by morning. The prints had vanished, leaving her to wonder whether the child she saw in the cemetery had followed her home. The line between the living and the dead feels thinner in Appalachia. The soil is old, heavy with memory, and sometimes those memories do not stay buried. There is another tale, one told by an old man who swore it happened when he was young, back when coal mining camps dotted the hills. He had been walking home from a shift underground, tired and coated in dust, when he decided to take a shortcut through the woods. The moon was bright enough to light his way, silver beams threading through the branches. Halfway through, he heard singing, faint, melodic, a woman's voice carrying through the trees. At first, it was beautiful, the kind of sound that draws you closer without thinking. He followed it, stepping carefully through the underbrush. The singing grew clearer, wrapping around him like a lullaby. But then, without warning, it shifted. The melody twisted sour and sharp, turning from soothing to sinister in an instant. His stomach churned, and dread clawed at him. He broke into a run, the voice chasing him louder with every step. No matter how fast he moved, it seemed to stay just behind him, whispering now, hissing words he could not understand. When he burst out of the woods onto the dirt road, the voice stopped. Silence pressed in, broken only by his ragged breathing. He swore that if he had stayed another moment, he would not have made it out. Others in the camp later told him he had encountered a siren spirit, a voice that lured men from the path and led them into the dark, never to return. He never took that shortcut again, and he warned anyone who would listen. If you hear singing in the woods at night, do not follow. The mountains carry songs, but not all of them are meant for human ears. The roads that wind through the heart of Appalachia have long been considered dangerous after dark, not because of the cliffs or the potholes, but because of what lurks just beyond the beams of your headlights. Drivers whisper about things they see only for a split second. Figures that vanish the moment you blink, leaving you questioning whether you imagined it or if the mountain was showing you something you were not meant to see. Marcus was driving one of those winding roads late one October night, returning home from visiting a friend in a nearby town. His route took him past a stretch of forest with no cell service, no streetlights, and no houses for miles. The kind of road where you feel like the world has been stripped away, leaving just you, your car, and the trees pressing in on both sides. The radio had gone static halfway through the drive, and the silence weighed heavy, broken only by the hum of the engine. Marcus gripped the wheel tighter, fighting off the unease that always seemed to come with this stretch of road. That was when he saw it. At first he thought it was a deer, stepping out from the trees into the edge of his headlights. But the longer he stared, the less sense it made. It stood on two legs, tall and thin, its limbs impossibly long, its skin pale as bone, its head tilted slightly. As if it were studying him, Marcus slammed on the brakes, his tires screeching against the pavement. The thing did not flinch, it only cocked its head further, like a curious predator deciding whether to strike. Then in the blink of an eye it was gone. One moment it stood in the center of the road, and the next it had vanished into the trees. Marcus sat frozen, his heart pounding so loud he swore it filled the car. He wanted to throw the car in reverse, to backtrack and take the long way home. But something deep inside told him not to linger. He pressed the accelerator, speeding past the spot where it had stood, his eyes locked forward. But the sense of being watched never left. He checked his rearview mirror, and that was when his stomach dropped. In the faint glow of his taillights, he saw it again, running on all fours impossibly fast, keeping pace with his car, its body twisted unnaturally, limbs bending the wrong way as it scuttled along the road. Marcus floored it, his tires skidding as he took the turns faster than he should have. For miles it chased him, never slowing, never tiring. Only when the first lights of town appeared did it vanish, slipping back into the trees as if it had never been there at all. Marcus never drove that road again. To this day, when asked, he will not say what it was he saw that night, only that some parts of Appalachia do not belong to us. The mountains are filled with things that do not fit neatly into our understanding, and sometimes they appear when you least expect them. A woman named Claire learned this one summer when she and her husband moved into an old farmhouse on the outskirts of a small mountain town. The house had been empty for years, its paint peeling and roof sagging, but it was cheap and they were eager to start fresh. The locals warned them, though, not about the house itself, but about the field behind it. "Stay out after dark," one old man told her at the grocery store, "and keep your windows shut at night." Claire brushed it off as superstition. That first week, she and her husband worked late into the evenings, repairing what they could, laughing about how the place felt like it belonged in a ghost story. But laughter only carried them so far. One night, Claire woke to the sound of whispers drifting through the open bedroom window. At first, she thought it was the wind in the tall grass of the field, but then the whispers grew louder, sharper, distinct, multiple voices murmuring just beyond the glass. Her husband slept soundly beside her. She crept to the window, her heart hammering, and peered out into the moonlit field. Figures stood in the tall grass, barely visible, their shapes swaying like stalks in the wind. She could not count them, 3, 4, maybe more, but their heads all turned toward her window in unison. The whispers stopped. Claire stumbled back, slamming the window shut and locking it. The next morning, she convinced herself it had been a dream, but when she checked the field, she found it flattened in a perfect circle, as though something had stood there for hours. The whispers came again the following night, and the night after that. Her husband heard nothing, but Claire could not ignore them. She tried earplugs, tried sleeping downstairs, even tried recording the sounds on her phone. But the moment she hit play, the recordings were nothing but static. The townsfolk shook their heads when she mentioned it. "You should have listened," they told her. "That field has been cursed longer than anyone can remember." By the end of summer, she and her husband packed up and left. The house still stands, windows shuttered, paint peeling further, waiting for someone else to ignore the warnings. Not all hauntings are tied to houses. Sometimes they are tied to the land itself. And the land remembers. Some stories are more subtle, the kind that leave you questioning your own senses, like the account of a hiker named Ben, who spent a weekend backpacking deep in the mountains. Far from any marked trail, he carried only the essentials: food, water, tent, and flashlight. He craved solitude, the kind of peace you only find when the world has gone completely still. That night, lying in his tent, he heard the crunch of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, circling his camp. His blood ran cold, but he told himself it was an animal. He gripped his flashlight, waiting. The steps stopped. And then came a voice, low, raspy, whispering his name. Ben froze. No one knew where he was. He had told no one his exact route. The voice circled with the steps, always just outside the thin nylon walls of his tent. It whispered things he could not understand. His name mixed in with words that made no sense. He lay there until dawn, never daring to unzip the flap. His flashlight gripped so tightly it dug into his palm. When the sun finally rose, he stepped outside, his legs trembling. The ground was undisturbed, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. But as he packed his tent, he noticed something carved into a tree at the edge of his camp. A single word etched deep into the bark: his name. Ben cut his trip short. To this day, he refuses to camp alone. The mountains can feel alive at night, as though they breathe with you, as though they know your name. There is a weight that settles over the mountains once the sun dips below the ridgeline, a heaviness that presses into your chest and makes every shadow feel alive. Travelers often speak of it, that uncanny sense that the darkness in Appalachia is different, thicker somehow, carrying secrets that the daylight cannot touch. Evelyn was a nurse who had just finished a double shift at the small regional hospital tucked into a valley town. It was well past midnight when she started the long drive home, her headlights cutting through an endless stretch of trees. Her body ached with exhaustion, her eyelids heavy, but she forced herself to stay alert. She knew too many stories about accidents on these roads. Halfway home, her headlights caught something on the side of the road. At first, she thought it was a man, standing perfectly still just at the tree line. But the longer she looked, the less human it appeared. Its arms were too long, its face pale and gaunt, its eyes glinting in the reflection of her beams. She slowed instinctively. Though fear screamed at her not to, the figure did not move, did not blink. It just stood there, head tilted slightly as though studying her. Evelyn's breath caught and she pressed harder on the gas. She did not want to pass it, did not want to be close enough to see it any clearer. But when she glanced in her rearview mirror, her stomach turned to ice. The figure was gone. The space where it had stood was empty, swallowed by trees. She tried to calm herself, telling her mind it was fatigue, a trick of shadows on the road, but then she heard it. Something dragging across the roof of her car. Slow, deliberate, Evelyn's hands trembled on the wheel. She did not dare look up, did not dare stop. She floored the accelerator, heart hammering as the dragging sound grew louder, then suddenly stopped. She drove the rest of the way home in silence, refusing to check her mirrors. The next morning, under the bright safety of daylight, she walked outside to check her car. Her stomach knotted when she saw it. 3 long scratches carved deep into the paint of her roof, starting at the windshield and running all the way to the trunk. She never took that road again, and she never worked a night shift again either. The mountains remind you, sometimes gently, sometimes violently, that you are not the only one moving in the dark. Another story comes from a man named Carter, who worked security at a small coal facility near a hollow long since abandoned. The company had kept the mine closed for years, but Carter's job was to patrol the grounds, making sure no one trespassed. Most nights were uneventful. He would sit in his truck, listen to the radio, and make a few rounds with his flashlight. But one night in late fall, the air so cold it burned in his lungs. Carter noticed something strange. The floodlights around the yard flickered, dimming for just a second before flaring back to life. He shrugged it off at first, assuming it was a wiring issue, but then he saw it. A figure was standing at the edge of the property, just beyond the reach of the lights. It looked like a man, but too thin, its shoulders sharp and hunched, its head bowed as though staring at the ground. Carter called out, shining his flashlight, but the beam seemed to bend away from it, as though the light itself refused to touch. He blinked, and it was gone. Unease prickled through him. He made his rounds quicker than usual, eager to return to his truck. But as he reached for the handle, his radio crackled. Static hissed through the speaker, followed by a voice, his own voice, saying his name. Carter dropped the radio, his heart slamming against his ribs. The static returned, louder now, filling the air like a swarm of bees. He kicked the radio under the truck and drove off the property, refusing to finish his shift. When he returned the next evening, the foreman scolded him for leaving early, but when Carter tried to explain, the man just shook his head. "You are not the first," he said quietly, "and you will not be the last." The mine never lets go of what it took. Carter quit the job within a week. He swore the mountains were alive, that they had mouths and voices, and sometimes they borrowed yours to remind you of it. The deeper you go into these hills, the stranger the nights become. Some stories are not about what you see, but about what you feel pressing in, suffocating, reminding you that you are trespassing in something ancient. Like the account of 3 friends who decided to camp at the base of a waterfall known locally as Devil's Step. The falls crashed down into a rocky basin, and by day it was beautiful, a place families visited for picnics. But at night, locals warned no one stayed. The friends thought it would be a thrill to test the stories. At first, everything seemed fine. They pitched their tent, built a fire, and laughed into the night. The roar of the falls drowned out the forest's usual sounds, but the boys paid it no mind. Around midnight, though, the fire sputtered out. One of them got up to gather more wood, but when he returned, he was pale, shaking his hands empty. "There is someone out there," he whispered. Standing in the spray of the falls, the others laughed, assuming he was messing with them, but then they saw it too. A tall, dark figure stood at the base of the waterfall, motionless as though carved from stone. One of them called out, their voice cracking. The figure did not respond. It only tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion. Before stepping forward, the roar of the water seemed to swallow the world. Yet somehow they could hear the crunch of its footsteps on wet rock. The friends panicked, scrambling for their packs. Abandoning the tent and fire, they fled down the trail, not daring to look back, their lungs burning, legs aching. When they finally reached the car and peeled away, they swore they could still hear the falls, even miles from the site, and over it, a low, guttural laugh. The tent and supplies were left behind, claimed by the mountain. The 3 never returned to Devil's Step, and when asked, they only said, "It is not a place meant for us after dark." Sometimes, in Appalachia, the warnings are not superstition. They are survival. The forest was silent in a way that felt unnatural. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl because you know it is hiding something. Owen had been hiking for years, comfortable in the Appalachian backcountry, but even he could not shake the unease of this particular trail. The locals had called it Black Hollow, though no map marked it. And when he asked for directions at a gas station, the old man behind the counter had frowned. "If you are smart, you will stick to the marked paths," he warned. Owen laughed it off. He wanted solitude. What he found was something else entirely. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridgeline, Owen realized he had misjudged how long the trail would take. Darkness poured in fast, swallowing the woods around him. He set up camp in a small clearing, his tent lit faintly by a lantern inside. The night was cool, damp and heavy, but it was the quiet that made his chest tighten. Not a single bird, not the chirp of crickets, not even the rustle of leaves. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. He tried to sleep, but the unease grew unbearable. Around midnight, he heard it, something moving just beyond the circle of light his lantern cast. A slow, deliberate pacing. He held his breath. Every muscle in his body tensed. When he finally gathered the courage to unzip the flap and shine his flashlight, there was nothing, only trees. Their shadows long and twisted. He retreated back inside, telling himself it was just nerves, but then he heard the whisper. It was faint at first, almost like the wind, but the longer he listened, the clearer it became. Someone was speaking his name, his pulse hammered. He sat frozen, staring at the thin fabric of the tent. And that was when a hand pressed against it from the outside. Long fingers dragged slowly down the surface, pulling the nylon tight against his face. He scrambled back, fumbling for his knife. But by the time he slashed the zipper open, the clearing was empty. The lantern flickered, then went dark. In the suffocating blackness, he heard the whisper again. This time, right at his ear, Owen fled that night. Abandoning his gear, days later, another hiker found the camp. The tent was shredded, the lantern crushed, and carved into the trunk of the nearest tree was a single word: Owen, the mountains keep names deep in the coal country. Another story circulates among miners, one that has been told for decades. They speak of a tunnel long sealed after a collapse, where an entire crew was buried alive. The company boarded it shut. But those who worked the night shift swore the men never left. Tommy was new to the job when he first heard the whispers about the sealed tunnel. He dismissed them as superstition, stories meant to scare rookies. But one night, while patrolling the lower levels, he heard something that made his blood run cold. It was faint at first, a muffled pounding, like fists against stone. He froze, his lamp beam trembling as he aimed it toward the sealed entrance. The sound grew louder, pounding, scraping, and then voices, desperate, echoing voices calling for help. Tommy stumbled back, his chest tightening. He radioed his foreman, but the line was nothing but static. He ran for the lift, but before he reached it, his lamp flickered and died. Darkness swallowed him whole. And in that blackness he heard footsteps, slow, dragging footsteps growing closer. He pressed himself against the wall, tears burning his eyes, and whispered to himself that it was not real. But then, in the dark, a hand brushed against his arm. Cold, wet, he screamed and bolted, sprinting through the tunnels until he found light again. When he told the others, they only shook their heads. "The dead are still working," an old miner said. "You heard them, same as we all have." Tommy quit within a week. The mine still runs, and the sealed tunnel still waits, its walls holding the cries of men who never made it out. Sometimes the ground itself remembers the dead, and it will remind you if you listen too closely. Not all the horrors of the mountains stay buried beneath earth and stone. Some linger in the open, waiting for nightfall. Lena was driving home from her shift at a diner when she noticed a figure on the side of the road. At first she thought it was a hitchhiker, but as her headlights swept over him, dread knotted her stomach. His clothes were soaked, his skin pale, his eyes sunken like he had drowned. She slowed, instinct warring with fear. The figure raised his arm. Pointing down the road, his mouth moved. But she heard nothing. She pressed the gas, speeding past. But when she looked into the rearview mirror, the road behind her was empty. She thought she had escaped, but minutes later, the air inside her car grew damp, heavy with the smell of river water. Drops trickled down her windshield. From the inside, her radio crackled with static, and through it came a garbled voice. Choked with water, her vision blurred, panic clawing at her chest. She pulled over, stumbling out of the car, gasping for air. When she finally looked back, she saw him again, standing in her back seat. Staring through the glass, Lena never drove that road again. Others say they have seen the same figure, always near the river bend where a man had drowned years ago. They say he never made it home, and now he waits for someone to give him a ride he will never finish. The mountains hold their dead close, but sometimes they do not rest quietly, and sometimes what you meet out there is not a ghost, not a memory, but something older, something that was here before people set foot in these hills. A hunter named Cal experienced this one November night. He was tracking deer near a ridge, his rifle slung over his shoulder. When the forest grew quiet, no wind, no animals, not even the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. Though he swore he was still walking, it was as if the world itself had muted. He stopped, his breath frosting in the air. That was when he saw it, a shape crouched low among the trees, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. At first he thought it was a bear, but the longer he looked, the less sense it made. Its limbs were too long, its body hunched at odd angles, and its eyes were human. It rose slowly, impossibly tall, and let out a sound that was not a growl but a scream, high-pitched and piercing, echoing off the mountains. Cal dropped his rifle and ran, his legs burning as he tore through the forest. Behind him he heard it moving, crashing through the underbrush. Impossibly fast, he stumbled into a clearing, moonlight spilling down, and it stopped. He dared to look back, and there it was, standing at the tree line, its head cocked, watching him. It did not follow him out of the trees. It only stood there, swaying slightly, until he turned and fled down the mountain. Cal never spoke of it again, but others whispered of creatures older than the hills, things that watch and wait in the dark. The Appalachians are full of shadows, and some shadows are alive. The road that snaked along the ridgeline felt endless, the kind of stretch that seemed to loop back on itself no matter how far you drove. Miles of pitch-black forest pressed in on either side, the trees gnarled and skeletal under the pale wash of the moon. David was returning from visiting family in a neighboring county, his headlights the only light for miles. He had driven this road dozens of times before, but that night it felt different, quieter, heavier, as though the darkness itself was waiting for him. He had just rounded a bend when his radio snapped on, though he had switched it off hours earlier. Static filled the cab, hissing and crackling, until through it came a voice. It was his own. David froze. His hand hovering over the dial, the voice on the radio repeated his name, low and distorted like it was underwater. Then after a long pause, it whispered, "Turn around." His grip tightened on the wheel, every instinct screaming at him not to. He pressed harder on the gas instead, his pulse thundering. The voice laughed, a warped sound that made his skin crawl before cutting out a mile down the road. Something moved in his headlights. At first, it looked like a person staggering across the asphalt. He swerved to avoid it, tires screeching as he pulled to the shoulder. When he looked back, the road was empty, heart racing. He rolled his window down, straining to hear. The forest was silent. No crickets, no wind. And then, from the trees, came the sound of something running, fast, heavy, and coming straight for him. David floored the accelerator, peeling out so hard the car fishtailed before gripping the asphalt. He did not look back, not until he reached the first lights of town. When he finally did, his blood ran cold. On the back window of his car, smeared in condensation, were 3 words. "Still behind you, the mountains whisper warnings, but sometimes they are too late." Not all encounters come from the road. Some come when you are supposed to feel safest, inside your own home. Mara had grown up in a cabin her grandfather built, nestled deep in the woods. The nearest neighbor miles away, she loved the solitude. The way the stars stretched endlessly overhead, unbroken by city lights. But the older she got, the more the nights unnerved her. Her grandfather had warned her, "Do not open the door after dark, no matter who knocks." She always thought it was superstition, until the night she learned better. It was late. The kind of late where the clock ticks too loud and the house creaks with every shift of the wind. Mara was reading in bed when the knock came. Soft at first, then louder, 3 raps that echoed through the cabin. Her stomach tightened. No one visited this late. No one ever visited unannounced. She crept to the window, pulling the curtain just enough to peek. At the edge of the porch, a figure stood. A woman, pale and thin, her hair hanging in tangled strings. Mara's breath caught. The woman's eyes were fixed on the door, unblinking then as though she sensed being watched. Her head turned sharply, locking eyes with Mara through the glass. Mara stumbled back, her heart slamming against her ribs. The knocking started again, harder this time, shaking the door on its hinges. "Let me in," the woman's voice rasped. Her grandfather's words screamed in her head. She backed away, every instinct telling her to run, to hide. After long, agonizing minutes, the knocking stopped. The silence stretched until dawn. When she finally opened the door in daylight, her stomach turned. Across the wood were long scratches, deep and jagged, as though claws had raked against it, and in the dirt of the yard, barefoot prints led from the forest to the porch, but none led away. She moved out soon after. Unable to endure the nights, locals whispered she had been visited by one of the lost women of the woods, spirits that wander until someone invites them inside. The mountains do not forget the broken, and sometimes they come knocking. Another story comes from 2 brothers who had spent their youth exploring abandoned places in the hills. One autumn night, they decided to investigate an old church that had been closed for decades. Its steeple leaned, the wood blackened with age. Its windows boarded, but not enough to keep the wind from howling through. The air inside was stale, heavy with mildew and rot. The pews were warped, the altar broken, the floor littered with fallen plaster. They explored by flashlight, laughing nervously, daring each other to step farther into the shadows. Then one of them noticed something strange in the dust covering the floor. Fresh footprints led straight down the aisle toward the altar. The laughter died instantly. They were the only ones there, or at least they thought they were. The brothers followed the prints, their lights shaking. The trail stopped in front of the altar, and there, carved deep into the wood, was a symbol neither of them recognized. Circles overlapping, jagged lines cutting through. Before they could speak, the church grew unbearably cold. their breaths misting in the air. From the shadows of the back pew came a sound, a low, guttural growl. They spun their lights toward it, but the beam caught nothing. The growl grew louder, closer, until it filled the church. The brothers bolted, their footsteps echoing off the walls as the sound chased them. They burst into the night, gasping for air, and did not stop running until they reached the car. When they looked back, the church windows glowed faintly from within, though neither of them had touched a light. That building still stands, rotting deeper into the earth. No one dares to step inside after dark. They say the congregation never left, that whatever was worshipped there still demands prayer. Some places are not abandoned, they are waiting. Night in the Appalachian backwoods has a way of swallowing sound. Even the usual symphony of crickets and owls seems to die off without warning, leaving only the sound of your own breath. For three friends camping deep in the hollows, that silence came like a warning they did not understand until it was too late. They had set up camp by a creek, a perfect spot they thought, flat ground, clear water, and just far enough from the main trail to feel like a true escape. The fire crackled, laughter rolled out into the trees, and for a while it felt like nothing could touch them. But sometime past midnight the forest went still. "Listen," one of them whispered. The laughter faded. The only sound left was the creek, faint and steady. Then faintly came the crunch of leaves, slow, deliberate. Not the darting steps of an animal, something heavier. They turned their flashlights into the trees, beams cutting through the dark. Nothing moved. Nothing looked back. The crunching stopped, trying to shake it off. They returned to the fire, talking louder, forcing themselves to ignore the unease pressing in. But then one of them froze. In the glow of the flames, just at the edge of sight, a shadow shifted, tall, too tall. The firelight seemed to bend around it. They stood, hearts pounding. "Who's out there?" one of them shouted, but the woods gave no answer. The shadow melted back into the trees. No one slept that night. They sat in silence, clutching sticks like weapons. Watching the woods at dawn, they packed without a word. When they returned weeks later, out of stubborn curiosity, they found something carved into the tree they had camped beside. A perfect circle cut deep into the bark, with a cross through its center. Beneath it, scratched into the wood, were three stick figures. The mountains had watched them, and the mountains had marked them. But not all horrors hide in the trees. Some slip into the quiet roads, where headlights cannot always save you. On a foggy October evening, Ellen was driving the back roads home from work, her tires humming against the cracked asphalt. The mist clung low, turning every tree into a phantom, every fence post into a lurking figure. She gripped the wheel tighter, her eyes straining against the veil. Then through the fog she saw it, a man standing in the middle of the road. She slammed the brakes, heart leaping into her throat. The car skidded, tires squealing, stopping just feet away. She blinked hard, but the man was gone. Breathing fast, she rolled down her window, leaning out into the cold night air. "Hello?" Her voice wavered. The fog pressed against her words, swallowing them whole. She started to roll the window back up when something tapped the glass. Hard once, twice, her head whipped around. Nothing stood beside her car, but the glass frosted where the taps had been. Like a handprint pressed against ice, she gunned the accelerator and tore through the fog, not stopping until she reached her driveway. Later that night, as she lay in bed, the tapping came again, slow, steady. Against her bedroom window, the fog does not always stay outside. Sometimes it follows you home, and then there are the stories passed quietly from family to family. Warnings buried inside tradition. Jacob grew up hearing about the Watchers, figures his grandmother swore lived in the ridges, guarding something older than memory. He laughed it off until one autumn, when he and his cousin took rifles into the woods to hunt. They had been walking for hours when Jacob noticed something odd. Every time they stopped, the forest seemed to stop with them. No birds, no rustling leaves, only the sound of their own breath. Then came the whistling. It drifted through the trees, low and eerie, carrying a tune Jacob did not recognize. His cousin's face drained of color. "We need to go," he whispered. But Jacob wanted to know who else was out there. He called out, his voice bouncing weakly against the trunks. The whistling stopped. The silence was crushing. Then behind him, the tune picked up again. But when Jacob spun around, there was nothing, no one. Just endless trees. They ran, crashing through brush, not caring about the noise. But the whistling kept pace, weaving between the trunks, always just behind them. It only stopped when they burst from the tree line back into their family's yard. Gasping for air, their grandmother was waiting on the porch, her eyes hard. "I told you," she said, "they do not like to be found." To this day, Jacob cannot hear someone whistle in the dark without feeling the hair rise on the back of his neck. Because in Appalachia, if you hear whistling where no one should be, it means you are being followed. The night had a way of making the familiar unfamiliar. What looked safe in daylight turned into something unrecognizable when the sun disappeared behind the Appalachian ridges. Caleb knew this well. He had worked night shifts for years at a small logging site tucked deep into the woods. The road there was lonely, his headlights often the only glow cutting through the endless trees. But one night, that loneliness shifted into something else. It began just after midnight. Caleb was finishing paperwork inside the small wooden office when the power flickered. The overhead bulb buzzed and dimmed before finally going dark, leaving only the weak light of his lantern. He muttered under his breath, grabbing the lantern to check the fuse box. Stepping outside, the cold slapped him awake. The yard, usually lit by floodlights, was swallowed in black. Beyond the machines and log piles, the forest stood tall and silent, a wall of shadow. He walked toward the shed where the fuse box sat, the lantern casting long, jittering shapes across the gravel. That was when he heard it. A whistle, low, drawn out, carrying faintly from the trees. His blood chilled. He had grown up with the stories. Whistling at night meant you were being hunted. He froze, the lantern trembling in his grip. For a moment the forest was silent again. Then the whistle came closer. Caleb forced his legs to move, yanking the shed door open and fumbling with the box. His fingers shook as he flipped the switches. Nothing, the power stayed out. The whistle stopped, replaced by the crunch of leaves, slow, deliberate steps moving closer. He backed into the shed, pressing against the wall, heart hammering so hard he thought it might give him away. The lantern flickered, and in that faint pulse of light he saw it. A shadow stretched across the doorway, tall, bent, its head nearly grazing the top of the frame. Caleb did not wait. He bolted out the back of the shed, sprinting across the yard, lungs burning, boots slipping on gravel. The whistle rose again, now shrill and mocking, echoing from everywhere at once. He dove into his truck, slamming the locks down, fumbling the keys into the ignition. The headlights flared to life. Cutting across the yard for a split second, something moved at the tree line, too thin, too long, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. Then it was gone. Caleb did not return to that job. He left the site for good, warning others never to linger there after dark. Some say the woods guard their own, that certain places are not meant for men to work or sleep. The mountains do not need to chase you far. They only need you to stand still long enough to be claimed. But not every horror comes with sound. Some creep silently, slipping into your life until it is too late. Kara and Luke had been driving through the Appalachians on a late-night trip, following back roads that twisted endlessly through valleys and ridges. Around 2 in the morning, exhausted, they pulled off onto a dirt road that led to a small clearing, deciding to sleep in the car until daylight. The clearing was still, the kind of quiet that felt deeper than silence. They reclined their seats, trying to drift off. But Kara woke to the faint sound of gravel crunching outside. Her eyes snapped open. The night was thick, the windows fogged. She shook Luke awake, whispering urgently. He blinked groggily as the sound came again. Slow footsteps circling the car. Luke sat up, peering through the glass. At first there was nothing, then faintly, the fogged window cleared as though someone had wiped a hand across it from the outside. A pale face pressed against the glass. Kara screamed. Luke fumbled to start the car, tires spinning as he tore out of the clearing. The figure did not follow, it simply stood, watching, until they vanished down the road, when they finally stopped hours later at a gas station. They stepped out to inspect the car. On the rear windshield, smeared into the condensation, were 3 words. Nice dreams tonight. They never returned to that road, and they never slept in their car again. The mountains have eyes where you least expect them. Some stories, though, do not come from strangers. They come from family, from warnings passed down that no one dares ignore. Isaac had always thought his grandmother's stories were meant to scare him into staying close to home. She would tell him about the dark places in the woods, Hollows where the air felt wrong, places where even the animals stayed away. She warned him that if he ever heard his name called at night, he must never answer. Years later, as a grown man, he found himself walking back from a friend's cabin after a late evening. The path was narrow, the woods crowding close, the moon barely filtering through the canopy. Halfway home, he heard it, his name, clear, close, spoken in his grandmother's voice. He froze, the hair on his neck stood on end. She had been dead for over a decade. The voice came again, softer this time, pleading, "Isaac, come here." He stumbled backward, his throat dry, the trees pressed tighter. Shadows bending, he remembered her warning. Do not answer, do not look. He ran. Branches tore at his arms, roots snagged his feet, but he did not stop until the lights of home flickered through the trees. He collapsed on the porch, gasping. In the distance, the voice called one last time. This time it was not his grandmother. It was his own. Isaac never walked that path again. He told his children the same warning his grandmother had told him. If the mountains call your name after dark, they are not calling you home, because sometimes the voice you trust most is the one meant to lead you away. And sometimes there is no warning at all, just the sudden realization that you are no longer alone. The hollow was quiet, too quiet, the kind of stillness that made the air heavy in your chest. Emma had lived in those mountains her whole life, the woods her backyard, the ridges her skyline. She knew their moods, the way the wind shifted before a storm, the way the animals scattered when a predator prowled. But nothing prepared her for the night she learned the woods could turn against her. She had been walking back from a friend's house. The shortcut, a narrow trail winding through the timber. The moon was high, silver light filtering through the branches. Her lantern swung at her side, its glow just enough to carve a small bubble of light in the darkness. Halfway home, she realized the forest was not as empty as it seemed. At first it was faint, like the sound of someone trailing behind. She paused, the lantern trembling slightly. Silence. She took another step. There it was again, leaves crunching, deliberate, in rhythm with her own. "Hello?" she called, her voice cracking. The woods swallowed the sound whole. Her pace quickened, the steps quickened too. When she stopped, they stopped. When she ran, they ran. Panic clawed its way up her throat as the lantern bobbed wildly. Shadows jerking across the trees, she burst from the trail onto the old dirt road. Heart hammering, chest heaving. For a moment, relief washed over her until she saw it, at the edge of the tree line. Something stood, too tall, its limbs too thin, its head cocked unnaturally to one side. Its face was nothing but pale blur, features smeared as though the night itself had erased them. Emma staggered back, clutching her lantern like a weapon. The figure did not move, it only watched. Then slowly, it raised one long hand and pointed at her. She ran harder than she ever had in her life, not stopping until her cabin door slammed shut behind her. She locked every bolt, pulled every curtain, sat trembling on the floor as the lantern guttered out. In the silence that followed, she heard it again, footsteps, circling her cabin, slow, measured, never leaving. By morning, there were no prints in the dirt, no sign of anything having been there at all, but she knew better. The mountains do not always leave proof. Sometimes the memory itself is the only scar. Others who live nearby whisper of the faceless thing, a watcher that lingers at the edges of sight. Feeding on fear, they say if you ever see it point, it is not marking you, it is claiming you, and some claims never end. The last tale comes from a man named Roy, a hunter who swore he would never set foot in the woods after what he saw one Halloween night. He had gone deeper than usual, chasing signs of deer into a hollow he did not recognize. The deeper he went, the quieter the forest became, until the silence pressed so hard against his ears, it made him dizzy. That was when he saw the fire. It flickered faintly through the trees, orange light pulsing like a heartbeat. Curious and cautious, he crept closer, his boots careful against the leaves. In the clearing ahead, shapes moved around the flames, figures, tall and draped in something that shimmered like shadow. Their voices rose in a low chant, words he did not understand. The firelight bent strangely around them. Never touching their faces, Roy crouched low, every nerve screaming at him to leave, but he could not look away. The chant grew louder, faster, until one figure turned toward the trees. Toward him, though its face was hidden, he felt its gaze pierce through the dark, pinning him in place. Then, in unison, every figure stopped their chant. The forest held its breath, the fire flared violently, a column of sparks shooting into the sky. And in that instant, Roy saw what they were circling, a shape on the ground. Something not quite human, not quite animal, its body twisted in impossible ways. He ran. Branches whipped his face, his lungs burned, but he did not stop until his truck came into view. He drove blind, tears blurring his vision, swearing he would never return. To this day, he keeps that promise. He tells his story rarely, but when he does, his voice shakes, his hands tremble. He says the mountains hold their own rituals, ones never meant for human eyes, and those who see them never truly walk away. Because in Appalachia, the night is not empty. The night belongs to them.